Welcome, everyone. My name is Bianca Melendez, and I am an officer of the Student National Education Association, also known as SNEA, around campus. And I will be serving as the facilitator for tonight's session, and I will be the one monitoring the chat box alongside with today's co-facilitator, Miss Hannah McCrae. Before we begin, I would like to go over some housekeeping rules. Please keep your microphones on mute unless instructed otherwise by our presenter. And please type all of your questions and comments in the chat box because we'll be answering them as soon as we get them. So thank you. And today's presentation will be led by Sarah Norris. And without further ado, the School of Teacher Education and Student National Education Association presents Copyright for Educators.
Well, thank you so much, Bianca, and Hannah as well, for being the facilitators today and also taking care of the chat and helping us navigate all the tech issues. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you to everyone for joining today. As Bianca mentioned, my name is Sarah Norris. I'm the Scholarly Communication Librarian at UCF Libraries. That is a very fancy title for someone who works with copyright and publishing. So if you have questions in those areas, chances are you're going to connect with me at some point. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, sort of start off today's presentation. If you have any questions at any time, feel free to put those in the chat box, and Bianca and Hannah are going to facilitate those. I am actually going to turn my video off, not because I don't want you to see my smiling face at this point in the day, but because I've been having some internet challenges. So I wanted to make sure you can at least see a face with the voice who's presenting today. And then of course, I'll turn my video back on when we do Q&A at the end as well. I'm just trying to save that bandwidth though. If you have questions, because we're a small group, of course, you can use that chat box, but do feel free to raise your hand too, and we can have you unmute your mic if you have questions as well. So go ahead and do that. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about copyright for educators, thinking about using copyrighted content in the classroom. And this is a complex topic. So whenever I do a presentation about copyright and any of the aspects of copyright, I always say, if you remember one thing from today, it's know that you can contact the library and that we can help you in this particular area. And of course, a lot of other areas as well. And also that I am a self-proclaimed copyright nerd. So if you have copyright questions, know that I love copyright stuff. So please feel free to reach out. No question is too strange or complicated for me to assist. And of course, because we're talking about legal issues and legal topics, I always have to give the disclaimer that anything that we talk about today is for informational purposes. I am not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV, so that kind of thing. But again, know that you can come reach out to me and we can talk through anything that you have questions about. Just kind of giving you a bit of landscape of what we're going to cover today. Again, we're going to talk about a lot of different aspects of copyright. We're going to look at these as sort of broad, high level. So again, know that if you have questions, we can always talk through those. I do hope we'll have some time to talk through some of those classroom scenarios as well as any general questions that you have. But what I always like to do when we talk about copyright is just sort of give us an understanding of copyright basics, sort of framing the conversation of copyright, because it is complex and chances are you're familiar with some aspects, but maybe not as familiar with some others. We're going to take a look specifically at things like the public domain and fair use. Fair use is something that we see occur in the classroom when we're thinking about using copyrighted content for instructional materials for our students. So that's something we really want to cover. We'll also look at things like Creative Commons licenses, and then we'll talk a little bit about the difference between online versus face-to-face, because when I started this presentation several years ago for KnightED Talks, we really thought about face-to-face teaching, but because of the pandemic and the ways in which educators are teaching primarily online now, I wanted to mention some of the online aspects for you to think through. And as I said, we'll talk through some copyright scenarios. Normally when I do this in a face-to-face setting, we can have sort of a group conversation about how do you feel about copyright. So what I'd love for us to think about right now is using the chat box, sort of chime in some things that you might feel about copyright. So when you think about copyright, what is the first thing that comes to mind for you? And Bianca and Hannah will facilitate some of that. Any comments that come in? I'll give you just a minute there. And do we have anything coming in so far, or?
We have one. It's from Ishan, and it says it protects authors and creators.
Great, excellent. So copyright is a form of protection. Good, we're going to talk about that. Any other thoughts?
Zelly Marie says that you can get in trouble for breaking it.
Yes, that's usually the one that most people will say when we start to think about copyright, is we're a little afraid of infringement and getting in trouble. So we want to be respectful of copyright. So yeah, copyright can be a great thing, but sometimes copyright can feel a little overwhelming too when we think about protection and worrying that we might get in trouble. Hopefully today we're gonna assuage some of those fears and give you some strategies to think about using copyrighted content in different ways without having to worry about getting in trouble. So we touched on this a little bit, but I do always like to mention why copyright and copyright in the classroom is so important. Certainly copyright is, as one of the comments mentioned, an important piece of protection for you as the creator of copyrighted content. But I think it's also really important to remember that copyright is available also as users of copyrighted content to help us navigate what we can and can't do with someone else's work. And also there are pieces of copyright law that really help us be flexible with using other people's copyrighted content under the guise of fair use. So there's a lot of different things that are there to help make copyright a little less scary for us. And equally, when we think about copyright in the classroom, there are also a lot of other considerations that we think about. Of course, as someone mentioned, we don't want to get in trouble. We want to avoid infringement. So we want to make sure that we're using things ethically and morally when we're thinking about using copyrighted content in our classroom. We certainly want to make sure that we're having high academic integrity, both as users and creators of copyrighted content. And of course, we want to use high quality things in our teaching and learning purposes. So many times that means using someone else's copyrighted content, whether it's a class textbook or it's storybooks or other kinds of things in the classroom. And we may also be creating copyrighted content in the classroom. Our students, ourselves, whether it's lesson plans, other kinds of presentations, things that we're using to support teaching and learning. Those copyright kind of comes into the fore there. And of course, sort of avoiding infringement and also upholding that academic integrity, we want to use fair use. We want to be able to use that and use other people's copyrighted content without that worry of being in trouble for using it. So today we're going to try to have a little bit of fun when we talk about copyright. So we are going to talk a lot about these sort of definitions and fundamentals, but I like to use real world applications. And so in today's presentation, we're going to talk about copyright throughout today in the context of this photograph of my cute cat, Cactus. So Cactus is a polydactyl cat. You'll notice that he has real kitten mittens, and that's going to play into today's copyright conversation. That's an important aspect because we're going to show some examples of how someone might use this photograph of Cactus without permission or with permission under the guise of fair use and general copyright. So keep that in mind. And of course, having a fun, cute photo of a cat's not too bad way to go through a copyright presentation. So we touched briefly on what is copyright, and I think all of us have a general sense of what copyright is. Essentially, it is a form of protection of things that are originally created by someone. I think one of the big distinctions about copyright that people may or may not realize is that it does cover both published and unpublished works. So you don't actually have to file for copyright in order to get copyright protection. You essentially get that copyright protection the moment you create something in what we call in sort of legalese a tangible medium, or sort of a fixed form. So whether it's a Word document and you're writing a research paper, or you're taking a photograph like I did of my cute cat cactus, once it's in that form, you automatically get copyright protection, which is pretty nifty. And what does that mean? Essentially means that you own the work, and you get sort of this bundle of rights of things that you can basically have control over because you own the copyright of that work. So whether it's reproducing it, so maybe you've written a lesson plan and you can reproduce that, you can make photocopies of it, you could share it with your colleagues if you want. Being able to make derivative work, so if something is in English and you want to put it into another language, you could do that. Being able to publicly display and perform it. But I think the most critical piece of that is really the ability to tell other people what they can do with your work. So you get all these different bundles, but ultimately you are the person who controls what people can do with your work. There are some caveats to that because we're going to talk about fair use and what that means. And of course, if you have given away your copyright, this stuff isn't going to apply. But again, you don't have to file for copyright in order to get these protections. So it's pretty nice. So we're going to take a look back at Cactus, that cute little photo, and you can see, so hey, I own it. I've got all these bundles of rights, so I can do pretty much what I want to with that photo because I own the copyright. So I can text that photo to somebody, I can post it on Instagram, or I can make a cute holiday greeting card if I wanted to with Cactus's photo and put a little hat on him and do whatever I would like. I have not done that middle one, as tempted as I am to put Cactus on a holiday card, but I could use all that if I wanted to because I own the copyright. And because I own the copyright, you've probably seen, how long does copyright last? It depends. I always sound like a lawyer when I say that, but that's why I have this great chart here because it really does depend. Copyright law has changed over the years. Right now, copyright protection is essentially life of the author plus 70 years. Or 120 years after the date of creation if you're a corporate entity like, say, Disney. But that has changed over the years. So this is a really great chart if you're using older content to see if it may or may not still be within copyright. Typically anything, this needs to get updated, but typically anything before 1925 is going to be in the public domain. So it's going to be freely available for you to use. You don't have to ask permission. And that is because public domain essentially has had its copyright terms lapsed. So the copyright terms have changed over the years. So they are things that you can use freely. They are not protected by copyright, so you don't have to ask anyone permission. You can use it as you would like. Of course, it's an academic. I always recommend you do cite your work, but you don't actually have to ask permission because it's essentially freely available in the market. Many things that are produced by the federal government, so if you go to a website where something is listed as .gov, most of those things are also going to be in the public domain. And then you can also donate works to the public domain. If you go to websites like Flickr, many people have actually donated their works and made them available for people to use freely, which is also a pretty cool thing. Here's some really good examples of public domain uses. So again, you don't have to ask permission. This work has been created. You can now build on it and do other things with it. So in the case of the first image here, I have a translation of Beowulf. Beowulf produced well before 1925, so it is in the public domain. You don't have to ask permission to use it. If you want to make a new translated work, you can totally do that. And in fact, once you make that new translation, you actually own the copyright of that now. So that specific translation is yours, which is also cool. Things like Disney. Disney's a great example of using public domain, maybe not always in the best ways, but Disney utilizes a lot of public domain fairy tales as the basis for feature films and other kinds of animation that they have done in the past. Snow White here is an example of something that was in the public domain. So Snow White itself, still free for anyone to use, and that's why you see things like Snow White and the Huntsman, different kinds of different films based on Snow White. But if you wanted to use that specific iteration of Snow White that Disney uses, that is actually protected by copyright. So you can see you can use something that's free, build on it, and create a new copyrighted work. Same thing with Night of the Living Dead. Fun fact, that horror film from the 70s is actually in the public domain because of an error that happened in copyright. They forgot to put in the copyright notice on the title screen of that film and therefore lost their copyright protection. So it is actually in the public domain. So there are lots of learning lessons. If you don't follow the law and do different things back in the day, you lost your copyright protection. Thankfully, copyright law has changed now, and so that doesn't really happen anymore. But back then, it was a real issue. So it's one of the reasons we look at that chart, because there's lots of weird things and examples that are actually in the public domain that are pretty contemporary. So we've got a sense of what basic copyright is, how public domain impacts copyright, where that is. So let's talk a little bit about fair use. What if you want to use something, but it is protected by copyright? That's where fair use comes into play. So fair use is essentially a part of the legal doctrine in copyright that says, hey, you can use copyrighted content in limited ways without actually having to ask for permission, so long as it follows a certain types of uses. And it's very common in education because education covers many of the uses, things like commentary and criticism, actual teaching, scholarship, research. And so the law says, hey, we recognize it's important to do all of these things, but still need to use copyrighted content. So it's built in to the copyright law. So it is there, and it is a right that I always encourage people to think through and use, and not be afraid to use copyrighted content, so long as we're thinking through fair use critically. We don't just say, well, it's for educational purposes, therefore I can use anything I want. Doesn't quite work that way. So some examples of fair use in pop culture. Many of you are probably pretty familiar with Google Images. Google Images actually uses images under the guise of fair use. So they don't ask for permission from any of these copyright holders. They essentially have aggregated them into one little search. The reason they can do that is because they have modified the images, they've made them lower resolution, they've adjusted the sizing, and then they also link the person who finds them in Google over to the original website where that copyrighted content exists. So that's a really cool way that fair use is applied. Of course, if you see anything on YouTube, there's lots of different channels that do film reviews and other kinds of things. They can use stills, short clips from films to help sort of, give some weight to their criticism and assessment. So it helps illustrate their point. So to be able to do that, they can use some content in a limited way. Of course, there's lots of complexities with YouTube, but generally that's how that's gonna work. And then lastly, I do always like to point out, he's a little old school right now, but Weird Al Yankovic is a musician who does parody songs in pop culture. And he's a great example because parody is almost always going to be covered under fair use because of the law. And so he doesn't actually have to ask Lady Gaga or another kind of musician for permission to parody their songs. He can do that under fair use. Weird Al's extra cool because he does actually ask permission as a sort of common courtesy in the music industry. So it's a good practice, even though you don't have to ask, he does that. So I think he's a great example. So when thinking about fair use, as I mentioned, even though fair use is available to use that copyrighted content in limited ways, it doesn't mean that you can just use it broadly. You really do need to think through critically what it is that you want to use, why do you want to use it, how much do you want to use, and if what you're using is going to negatively impact the original copyright holder's ability to benefit in the marketplace, i.e. make money. And that is almost always the factor that will sort of precipitate a legal case or litigation. So we always want to be careful about that. But we have something called the 4 fair use factors, these 4 points that I've kind of mentioned that help us assess, is what I want to do okay under sort of fair use? And it's a great way to sort of think through things critically. Because we don't have a lot of time today, I'm not going to talk through this too much, but just know that that is a piece that I will always encourage you to think through before you sort of use something for educational purposes. And that's because, you know, in every situation, especially for teaching and educational purposes, fair use isn't always going to apply. There's a really big difference between using an entire movie or song in what you want to do in your classroom versus a short clip to help emphasize a certain aspect of your course objectives. So there's some big differences there. And sort of fun facts for all of you with faculty here at UCF, we actually recommend no more than 10% of a work in order to sort of stay within the guidelines of fair use. So our general counsel recommends, hey, don't use too much of the work. So things to think through. And of course, if you have questions, you can always reach out and we can talk through your specific fair use question. So coming back to Cactus, oh goodness, there he is. So remember I mentioned he has polydactyl, he's a polydactyl cat, so he has extra toes. And I wanted to highlight some ways in which we might see Cactus in different ways. So we might see him in Google under a Google search. Say I've uploaded him to my personal website, that image might pop up under Google Images under fair use. So that might be one way. Say someone is doing a course on animal anatomy, and because Cactus has a really good example of those really adorable kitten mittens, they might want to use that photo. And so in that case, they might not need to ask permission because they're using it under the guise of fair use to help emphasize an example of cat anatomy. Same thing with cat history. So perhaps there's some discussion in this YouTube video about the history of cats and how they've evolved. And maybe the sort of genetic anomaly of polydactyl cats comes up. You could put it into that video without having to necessarily ask for permission. So there's some different ways that people might be able to use that cute photo of Cactus. And I mean, why wouldn't you want to use a cute photo of Cactus? He is pretty adorable. I might be biased, but he is cute. So when we understand copyright, we've got a sense of things that are freely available, things that we might be able to use that are still protected by copyright. What about licensed materials? We're going to take a look at specifically general licensing, and then we're going to look at Creative Commons licenses, because as educators specifically, if you're looking to use images or other kinds of things online, you're going to likely see more and more of Creative Commons licenses available with different kinds of content. So licensing sounds like a real fancy term, but essentially it just means you're giving someone permission to use your stuff. So that cute photo of Cactus that I have, I own the copyright. I can add a license to that and I can give you permission to use that content. And you know up front, hey, this license says I can do X, Y, and Z with it. So then I know ahead of time, tells me up front what I can and can't do with a piece of copyrighted content. So it's kind of a nice way for me to communicate with the end user on what to do with my works and what I'm okay with or not okay with. And of course, we see these a lot online. Use rights is a big thing. Anytime you download software updates from your phone, or any other kind of, you sign up for a program, or say you have Netflix or Hulu, you're essentially signing a license. So they're sort of everyday things that we encounter. They can be exclusive or not exclusive, just really depends on the license. Again, you're the copyright holder. If you have a license, you control what people can do. If lots of people can use your work, or if only one person can use your work. And it doesn't actually affect your copyright ownership. I'm just essentially saying, hey, you can use my content. So you still get to retain your copyright, but you get to tell people what to do with it. So it's helpful. So we're gonna look specifically at Creative Commons licenses. And Creative Commons licenses, if you have not heard of them, is a public copyright license that has really gained a lot of popularity, I would say in the last 15 to 20 years. It's basically a way for someone who owns copyright of a work to tell other people what they can do and encourage people to use and build on the work that they've created. So in the case of Cactus, if I made that freely available with a Creative Commons license, people could use it in lots of different ways because I give them permission to do that. And of course, this is also in addition to fair use, because fair use is something that would be an additional option as well. There's lots of different licensing out there. There are super flexible ones that say, hey, you can use my work pretty much however you want to. You can even sell it as long as you say that you got it from me. There's also really sort of more strict ones that say, hey, you can use it, but you can't sell it. You can't do anything other than use it in its current form. So there's lots of different flavors and flexibility with Creative Commons licenses. And as I mentioned, you see them in a lot of different places now. So we are seeing them a lot online. This is an example of a presentation that I gave through UCF Libraries, and I actually give Creative Commons licenses to all of my work as much as possible. So in this case, you can see sort of in the middle of the screen, it says rights, and it's got that little tiny logo that says CC BY. That's a Creative Commons license. And I basically say, hey, you can use it. The only thing I ask that you do is give me attribution, say that you got it from me. So you cite it appropriately. We also see it a lot on public sites like Flickr. You'll also see it on places like Wikimedia, Wikipedia, different sites like that will have images. In this case, this came from Flickr, and you can see if you click on the Some Rights Reserved, where I have the arrow there, it will actually tell you, hey, this has a license with it, and you can use it however you would like, as long as you give attribution. We also see a lot more museums and special collections and archives online that also utilize Creative Commons licenses. So if you're looking for images to support a lesson plan that you're creating, maybe a presentation that you're creating, looking for websites that have Creative Commons licenses is super duper helpful, because then you don't have to worry about assessing it for fair use or asking for copyright permission. So it's pretty nifty. And I'll share these slides with you as well, but there is some best practices for Creative Commons licenses and how you might give appropriate attribution, so you cite it appropriately. All right, so we're back to Cactus. I told you we're gonna keep him going throughout today's presentation. So here's Cactus. Remember that I own copyright. Remember that people can use Cactus's photo under the guise of fair use when we assess it. But what if I want to add a Creative Commons license to it? What does that mean when I actually do it? So let's put it into practice. So Cactus is totally ready for the weekend with this photo here. But say I have this particular license that I put on this photo, and essentially what I'm saying is you can use it in really creative ways. You can actually remix it. You can edit it. You can do, you modify it however you like, as long as you, one, say you got it from me, and then you also don't sell it. So if someone's having, say, you know, a tropical tiki party, they could use Cactus on their invitation and have this great photo with, you know, sort of clip art on top of it. And Cactus is currently catnapping right now, but don't think he wouldn't do this with his glasses and his tiki drink. And then if I have a really flexible license, say I'm really okay with people using my content, just basically as long as they say they got it from me, we could do the same thing. So in this case, say someone wants to actually put Cactus's image on a t-shirt and sell it, they could do that because of the license I gave is super flexible. All they would have to do is somewhere on that t-shirt have a little line that says, you know, copyright Sarah Norris on it. So they could sell it and I would be okay with that because I gave them that permission. So you can see there's lots of different options and flexibility. This is a little bit of an outdated chart, but I think it's a really good sort of cheat sheet to break down the different aspects that we talked about today, whether it's traditional copyright, it's something in the public domain, or something that has a Creative Commons license, just kind of breaks down what it is and what you can do with things. So I think it's a nice little chart. So I'll again share these slides with you. This is a great sort of handy tool that I always recommend people take a look at. So I'm going to stop there real quick because I've been talking quite a bit. Are there any questions that people have so far about sort of the copyright fundamentals?
So far, we don't have any in the chat, but if you guys have a question, feel free to write in the chat.
We have it just a second longer, but I'm going to guess no questions. Hopefully we'll have some time to talk through Q&A. Again, I want you to be, be open to asking questions if there's anything that you're not sure on. As we specifically start to talk about classroom scenarios, please feel free to ask questions. We can talk through anything that you're thinking about. So moving beyond the fundamentals, we understand sort of the copyright basics. Now, how do we make sure that we're copyright compliant in the classroom, right? Let's put this to practice. How do we actually do that? And I do want to kind of mention a couple of different distinguishing factors, and that's because there is a legal framework that really helps us navigate not only copyright in the face-to-face classroom, but also the online classroom. So one would think that those two things would be the same because essentially you're doing the same thing, but they are not. I see Hannah shaking her head. Yes, they are not. So what we can do in the face-to-face classroom does really vary from online. And that's partially because of the modality. When you are online, there is an inherent distribution factor that comes into play. It sounds really weird, but because you have to use an integrated library system or management system like Canvas, or you're using Google Hangout or Teams or all these different tools, Zoom, you are inherently redistributing that content in a different way. And that plays into different sort of scenarios with copyright. Additionally, copyright law didn't necessarily grow with the ways that we have evolved in teaching and the online class environment. So there's a lot of really great things that exist in the face-to-face classroom, things like the face-to-face classroom teaching exception, which says that you can publicly display and perform things, that you can print out different copies of, say, an article or handouts, but those things don't apply online. And that's because of the way the copyright law evolved. Of course, you can use fair use in the classroom, and that will apply in the online classroom too. We also have other things like the first sale doctrine. So this sounds, again, very fancy and complicated, but essentially it means that if you purchase something, say you purchased a Blu-ray copy of a film, you own it. So because you own it, you can then also, between the face-to-face classroom teaching exception and the first sale doctrine, show that film in class because of the things that exist there. But of course, that doesn't apply if there are licensing agreements in place. Big things to come to mind with that are things like streaming services. So fun facts, if you have a Netflix account or a Hulu account, typically those licenses say, you can use those for personal individual use only. Please don't share that with other people. You shouldn't be sharing your password. You shouldn't be using it for classroom purposes. And because of the licensing agreement, it actually supersedes copyright law. It sounds really strange, but the license actually trumps copyright. So in that case, you're gonna wanna make sure that you follow those rules. There are some exceptions. I know Netflix has gotten a lot more flexible. They have a certain collection of things that can be shown in the classroom. So you'd wanna double check that, but there is a bit more flexibility there. Did someone have a question? I thought I heard a mic there. Maybe not. So there are a lot of complexities there. And of course, if you have students with accessibility needs, there are pieces of the copyright law that are built and put into place to help you make certain materials accessible for them because of those accessibility needs. So that happens both face-to-face as well as online. So as I mentioned, the online environment sort of has evolved with copyright, but it hasn't necessarily grown or addressed the same sort of issues in the same kinds of way. So they did develop something called the Teach Act. I will say that it is pretty technical and it is pretty restrictive. So even at UCF, our general counsel tells UCF faculty their recommendation is to use fair use versus the Teach Act because it's pretty restrictive. And like I said, I mentioned this because as of right now, so many K through 12 as well as university courses are all online. So things to think about for the future as we sort of evolve with classroom teaching. So that piece may come into play. Again, fair use is going to be something you're going to want to think about, and there are some other pieces that we talked about from face to face. So know that they are sort of similar, but not quite the same. And if you have questions, it's good to ask not only the school that you might be employed at for the administration, what their policies are, but also to think through that critically. So how do we make sure that we're copyright compliant in the classroom? There's a lot of different ways that we might do that. We can always ask for permission. It's so funny because we talk about things like fair use and we talk about worrying that we're going to get in trouble, and yet we sometimes forget that asking for permission is an easy thing to do. The worst that someone tells you is no. So I always encourage people to reach out if they can find copyright holders to ask for permission. It is, of course, harder when we think about commercial publishers because they're, of course, less likely to get permission, but you never know, especially with small publishers, individuals. It's always worth asking. It's an easy sort of step. And again, if they say no, then you move on to some of the other options that we have available. You can actually pay to use copyrighted content through the Copyright Clearance Center. That is something that you can do. It is a little cost prohibitive though. And so that is a tricky area when we're thinking about the classroom. It can be quite expensive to essentially pay to use copyrighted content. We're always going to want to assess fair use if that applies and is reasonable. You always want to think through that, and I never want to, scare people from not using it. It is a right, and so we always want to think through that as an option. And of course, I always recommend looking for things that are available openly, things that you don't have to get permission for or that have that Creative Commons license we mentioned, because that's going to save you a lot of headaches. It's available, it's free, you don't have to get permission. And so it's something that you don't have to spend as much time trying to track down or assess to ensure that you can use it in the classroom. So as we start to unwind, I thought what might be a great thing is to sort of talk through some copyright scenarios. And I hope as we do this that you will chime in the chat box with any questions that you have. I'm hoping we normally do this face-to-face. And so when we do it face-to-face, we can talk through what people think might be what they would approach it with. But we'll try it with the chat. If it doesn't work, we'll just talk through the different scenarios. But scenario one, thinking about the things that we talked about today. So you found these great images on Google for your class. Are they okay to use in your class or your lesson plans as long as you give credit to the source? What do you think? I'll give folks a minute to think through that. And even if it's a yes, no, that's totally fine. We'll talk through a bit of why.
Mostly everyone right now is saying yes.
Saying yes. Okay. So I'm going to say it depends. So you may be able to use these as long as you give credit, but it very much depends, because my rule of thumb when we think about copyright and online is that everything that you find online is protected by copyright unless it's otherwise stated. And that's tricky because, right, we find things online, everything's open, right? It's available for me to find through Google. Shouldn't that be free? No, unfortunately it's not. Publicly accessible is not the same as copyright free. So whether you're using your own Instagram account and putting photos up, or you're looking for things in Google Images, copyright protection, remember, is available to someone the moment it's in that tangible form, and you don't have to file for it. So if copyright says that, I think, it's pretty sort of standard when things are available online that it's going to typically be protected by copyright. That doesn't mean that things online are all protected by copyright. There are certainly things that we highlighted that have Creative Commons licenses that might be in the public domain that are free for you to use. So we want to make sure that if we are finding things online, that we are looking for that copyright status. So again, if it's not clear, assume it is protected by copyright. So with that in mind, you're always going to want to ask permission if it's applicable or you feel comfortable doing that. And if you can find who the copyright holder might be, you can assess it using fair use. So again, we want to think through those critically. Are you using, 50 photos that someone has on their personal website, or is it one photo that you found under Google Images? So there's some, assessment we want to think about with how much of it you're going to use. Are you using it once? Are you using it all the time? That matters too. And again, we're going to look for things that are freely available. I'm going to show everybody, maybe quickly in the chat, has anybody ever used the advanced tools in Google Images? Hannah says yes. So I'm going to show you real quick since we are already online. So I'm going to go Google Images. So I'm going to show you a really cool hack that I like when it comes to looking for images and looking for things that are freely available without as much effort on my part, because it can be a challenge to find images. So let's just go with cat theme. And again, I apologize, my internet is a little slow today. So, oh boy, not surprised the cats. Well, it's better than it was before when Cats first came out. But yeah, the first time I did that, I was like, oh, wow, Cats the musical's up on, on Google Images. So we've done this search of cats. Now, if you click on one, say we're going to click on this really cute cat photo here. Remember I mentioned fair use and how Google Images is using these under the guise of fair use. Hey, look, they've got this nice little statement that says, here's the original website, and this image might be subject to copyright. So it's up to you to assess that. I am a busy person and sometimes a little lazy and like to have scale of efficiencies. And so for me, I don't really want to navigate through all of this. If it's just that I want to use a cute cat photo to illustrate a point in my presentation or something that I'm teaching. So I'm going to go up here to the top to this tools feature. And there's a really cool little spot that says usage rights. So if we click on that, we can see, oh, and they've updated it. Interesting. Was not like this 2 weeks ago. So normally this has a bunch of different other verbiage, which is essentially Creative Commons licenses that Google just renamed. But if you go here to usage rights and you get Creative Commons licenses, you are going to get things that are very open for you to use. You're going to find things that are in the public domain, and you're going to find things that have a Creative Commons license attached to them, which is pretty nifty. So like this website right here, Pixabay, is a really well-known public domain image website that has really high quality, great photos, and many of the photos I used in today's presentation actually came from Pixabay. So it's a great starting point. I know he's working with some lesson plans that students were working on, and we were using Pixabay, and even another site here, Wikimedia Commons, which also has a lot of public domain and Creative Commons licensed images. And as I mentioned, Flickr also has a lot of those things as well. So you kind of know when you go to this search and you look for Creative Commons licenses, this is stuff you don't have to ask permission for, that you can use in your lesson plans, class purposes, presentations, all sorts of stuff. So it's a really neat tool. And of course you can go to,
sorry, there's a
you're fine,
question in the chat. Sean wants to know, how is using an image in the classroom different from sharing the same image on a social media platform as far as copyright?
That's a really great question, Sean. So it's tricky. We are typically sharing things in social media under the guise of fair use because, and it depends on the image. If it's, I really like this image and I want to share it with you, we can argue the spontaneity aspect is a piece that might fall under fair use. It's really complicated. Even things like memes have a lot of challenges in copyright law. Generally, memes and GIFs are thought of as short aspects of copyrighted content and have some transformativeness to them. So they've been adjusted or altered in some way. And so there is an argument under copyright that fair use would apply with that as well. And if, say, I want to share something to express a point, like I've had a really bad day, so I'm taking a GIF or GIF, however you want to pronounce it, of, say, Anna from Frozen, where she collapses, you know, that's sort of expressing, I've had a terrible day. And this is sort of visually representing the commentary I'm making about the bad day that I had. We can argue some fair use aspects of that. Same if you go to like Disney World and you take a photo of the characters going by in the cavalcade right now. We're arguing fair use because it's spontaneous, it's limited. There's a bunch of different complexities, but that's a really great question. It's tricky, it's complicated, but generally we're gonna say fair use is likely going to apply in social media. Great question. Any other questions as we navigate images? All right, I'm gonna go on to the next one, and then we'll kind of gloss through these quickly because I know we're getting close-ish to time, so I'm gonna leave some more time for questions. This is another one that we get a lot. I wanna show a full-length film in my classroom using my Netflix account. Spoiler alert, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Am I allowed to do this? What do you think? And again, if you wanna put yes, no in the box, that would be great.
I've got no's, I've got it depends.
I like it. People are already starting to sound like me. Good job. Sounding like a lawyer. I love it. So yes, in this case, I'm going to say typically no. Again, it may be okay, it may be permissible depending on the license, but more importantly, it also deals with your curriculum. So we might not be able to show a full-length film in the classroom to begin with, if it's just filler, if it doesn't actually have any relation to our class curriculum. So again, if you're trying to have a lesson that's related to a certain film or documentary that shows a certain aspect, maybe it's a PBS documentary or something like that, that talks about current issue, that might be permissible. But if we're just showing a film to entertain students, that is not necessarily going to be permissible. And then we added the complexity of the Netflix account piece. So again, teachers should not be using their personal accounts for streaming services because of the licensing that exists. We do, of course, have some potential exceptions through Netflix, because Netflix is being a little bit more flexible right now with allowing teachers to use content in the classroom, but of course it depends. So kudos to those people who said it depends. And fair use might apply, but typically with a full-length feature film, it's not going to. And again, if it comes straight from Netflix, the license is going to supersede copyright. And then we're always going to want to look for legitimate copies of a film or a video. So no linking out to something that's in YouTube that's full length, no linking out to things that come from a BitTorrent website. We want to make sure that we are using a legitimate copy, whether it's a streaming video service that comes through a library, because libraries actually have access to a lot of streaming video. So a lot of our faculty at UCF use databases from UCF libraries that we actually license, and we have permission for them to share in the classroom. So we're purchasing a Blu-ray, things like that. So we want to make sure that we're, sort of using those critically. And then the last scenario, and then we'll open it up to questions. This is always a tricky one that I get. I want to scan worksheets that come from the textbook and put them up on my website so that parents of students can print them out in case they have forgotten them or don't have access to them. I would like to be able to email attachments to parents. Can I do this? We didn't really cover this a lot, but I think it's a good one to talk through. So what do you think? Do you think that worksheets from a book can be scanned and then sent to parents or put up on your website? Or is this one of those doozies that no one wants to weigh in on? I know it's a tough one.
Yeah, they're slowly starting to come in. But I've got a no with a question mark. I've got some no's. I've got it depends. Um, Ishan again said that I've seen some books expressly say it can be distributed / used.
Good. Yeah. So those are good things to think through critically. And yes, of course, it depends. And it certainly, if the book itself says yes, you are able to do that, then of course you can do that. But generally the Copyright Office says, yeah, when it comes to these consumables or these types of things, workbooks, exercises, standardized tests, things that come in those accompanying materials for teaching, typically you should not copy those. And again, of course, there's an it depends, always sound like a lawyer there, but there are exceptions, as Sean mentioned. Sometimes there will be express permission, but generally, no, you're not going to be able to copy that. We have this challenge too, even when we're thinking about full text journal articles, maybe that you found in UCF Libraries databases. So if you downloaded that and you wanted to share that PDF, say you're a faculty member, you want to put that in Canvas, based on our license, you can't actually do that. So putting that full text PDF, again, because it's for individual use. And so in this case, yeah, we want to be really careful about those consumables. So this one's a tricky one, but I do like to mention it because I know that this is a question that comes up a lot with K through 12. So something to think about. So sort of wrapping up, and then we'll open it up to any questions that you have. Hopefully I haven't scared you on copyright. Yes, it depends, but the good thing is that you do have your school as well as librarians, if you have a school media specialist, who are available to help you with copyright assistance. And of course, while you're a student here at UCF, you can always reach out to me. We can talk through any questions that you have or complexities that you're thinking through. But I do like to think through those things critically. Always, consider that copyright for every single thing that you want to use in the classroom. You know that sounds like a lot, but it's a really important thing to do, because that way you're not using other people's copyrighted content in ways that maybe isn't the way in which they intended. And I always think about it from the perspective of, what if it's your work, right? So we want to be good stewards of copyrighted content that other people create, especially, sort of to treat people the way you want to be treated. So if you have copyrighted content and you would feel really uncomfortable if somebody was using your stuff in ways that weren't productive or they didn't ask you for permission, you want to be good stewards both as the user and creator of copyrighted content. So always something we want to think about. As I mentioned, anything that you find, assume it's protected by copyright until you can prove otherwise. That's just going to put you in good stead and not put you in scenarios where you're using things and going, oh, I didn't know was, not protected by copyright. Of course, like I said, when in doubt, you can ask for permission. As I said, the worst they say is no. It's a good practice. And you'd be surprised at how often I actually get copyright holders to come back and say, yes, it's fine. So it's always worth exploring. Definitely look for those things that are in the public domain or Creative Commons licensed. Because there are so many more of them online now, they're great resources, and they're things that will help avoid headaches or challenges with copyright and save you a lot of time as well. And then of course, we do want to make sure that we're citing things appropriately. And if there's a license, you want to follow that too. And then if you are thinking about fair use, know that you can use it. We just want to think through that critically when we think about those 4 fair use factors. So just because it's for educational purposes doesn't mean you have a blanket to use it however you would like to. You do just want to think through that critically. And again, you've got your friendly librarians always available to help you. And of course, if I'm going to model my own good behavior, you can see that I actually cited all of my public domain image references. I technically don't have to cite public domain because I don't need to get permission, but I like to do that as a matter of sort of, good modeling behavior of citing the things where I got them from. So know that is available. And of course, there's my information. I do have the bit.ly link there. If you want to get a hold of that presentation, you are more than welcome to use that link. If that link is problematic or you'd like me to send you a copy of it, you can always reach out to me too, and I'm always happy to do that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box or raise your hand. And I will put my camera back on so you can see I'm a real person.
So someone in the chat said that they would love a copy of that link.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Hold on one second. While we're doing that, I'll copy it and paste it in the chat box for you. One second. I'm going to share it with everyone. So there's the bit.ly there too. And again, if you have challenges, feel free to let me know. I can send you a copy of it as well. Well, if you're thinking about questions in the interim, thank you so much for listening today. I hope that it was informative and not too boring at this time of the day, because I know copyright is maybe never the most fun thing, but it's an important topic and it's important to think through critically. So I hope that it was helpful for you as you're thinking about using copyright in the classroom. Well, and I would say if you don't have any questions now, please feel free to reach out. Like I said, I'm a copyright nerd, so if you have questions, I always love to talk through different questions that you might have. Otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes. So a lot of people are saying like, thank you. It's helpful. Very interesting presentation. Thank you so much. So it's awesome.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for this incredibly informative presentation. I'm sure we've learned a lot about copywriting, and we'll definitely put these tools in our teacher toolbox. On behalf of the School of Teacher Education and Student National Education Association, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. And I'd also like to remind you that your attendance certificates will be sent to your emails. Let me go ahead and put that link in the chat box. So give me one moment. So I went ahead and I put in the link so you can get your certificate for today's presentation. If you would like to get involved with SNEA, I will also put in our website in the chat box, and there you'll find all the information that you need to join. So let me go ahead and do that as well. All right, I've gone ahead and put that information there in the chat box. And if you enjoyed this session, there's more in the chat box. I'm also going to add a link to the KnightED Talks website so you guys can see all the other exciting sessions that we have coming up. We hope to see you at our next KnightED Talks session, and we hope you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you so much.